Pharaohs Khufu and Khafre. You all know them very well. Is there something very important that we don't know about these pharaohs? What if Pharaohs Khufu and Khafre were the same person? What if the great pharaoh once decided to transform his name as part of a religious reformation? This theory is supported by multiple pieces of evidence. In this video, we will analyze the royal names of Pharaoh Khufu and Pharaoh Khafre. We will take a closer look at the two biggest pyramids in human history. We will delve into the history and traditions of the early dynasties of ancient Egypt and review the religious practices of the Old Kingdom. And we will find evidence that proves my theory that Khufu and Khafre were the same person. I think we should delve a bit into the early history of pyramid construction and the beginning of the Fourth Dynasty. The first pharaoh of the Fourth Dynasty was the famous Pharaoh Sneferu. He built two pyramids for himself, the Red Pyramid and the Bent Pyramid. Both are located a few hundred meters apart in the necropolis of Djoser, slightly south of Giza, near Cairo. We are well aware of the history of Khufu and Khafre, their reigns, and many historical facts that seem to provide great detail about this period. However, if we look deeper into this history, we will find many inconsistencies and contradictions. In this video, I would like to draw your attention to some of the discrepancies and inconsistencies in the history of Khufu and Khafre that we observe. There are quite a few of them, yet they are often overlooked. However, in my opinion, they are critically important for understanding the history of these pharaohs. The first thing to pay attention to is that when we examine historical sources describing the origins and reigns of Pharaohs Khufu and Khafre, we encounter a number of discrepancies. These inconsistencies appear both in ancient sources from the Old Kingdom and in later sources from antiquity and ancient Rome. Let's try to examine the origins and familial connections that are said to have existed between Pharaoh Khufu and Pharaoh Khafre. According to some sources, Pharaohs Khufu and Khafre were biological brothers. According to other sources, Pharaoh Khafre was the son of Pharaoh Khufu. The most widely accepted hypothesis states that Pharaoh Khafre was not the direct successor of Pharaoh Khufu, but instead inherited the throne from another of Khufu's sons, Pharaoh Djoser. Djoser was buried in a different location, in his own pyramid, which has not survived to this day, and was situated in Abu Rawash. Only after Djoser's death did Khafre become the pharaoh of Egypt and begin the construction of his pyramid on the Giza Plateau, next to the already completed pyramid of Khufu. However, most ancient Greek sources, which are based on the accounts of ancient Egyptian priests, tell us nothing about the reign of Pharaoh Djoser, but instead claim that Pharaoh Khafre immediately succeeded Pharaoh Khufu. They describe these two as the worst rulers in Egypt's history, stating that the people suffered greatly under their reigns due to the construction of the massive pyramids. As Pliny the Elder described them, they were nothing more than a mountain of vanity. Ancient Greek sources refer to Pharaohs Khufu and Khafre as biological brothers rather than father and son, and this may be a very important detail. The second thing worth paying attention to is the large number of statues and depictions of Pharaoh Khafre, while almost no surviving statues of Pharaoh Khufu exist. The statues of Pharaoh Khafre, as well as his inscriptions, have been found in Giza, in the Granite Temple and the Pyramid Temple. Additionally, it is quite possible that the Great Sphinx of Giza depicts the face of Pharaoh Khafre. However, nothing similar has been discovered for Pharaoh Khufu. The only known tiny statuette of Pharaoh Khufu was found in the latrine of the Temple of Osiris, in Abydos apparently, discarded there by a priest, simply thrown into the toilet. It is a great mystery why almost no statues or depictions of Pharaoh Khufu have survived. Ancient authors claimed this was because Pharaoh Khufu was disliked by his people, and after his death, all his statues and depictions were destroyed. But if that were the case, why were his pyramid and mortuary temples not destroyed as well? As it seems to me, the destruction of Pharaoh Khufu's statues could only have been carried out by his own command. Something must have compelled him to order the destruction of all existing statues of himself. This is my hypothesis, but perhaps it has as much right to exist as any other theory, since there are no definitive facts confirming any of them. Let's move on to the third question that arises in connection with the Great Pyramids on the Giza Plateau and their builders. But let's stop here. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more unique videos about Egypt in your recommendation feed. Moving on, Pharaohs Khufu and Khafre. To better understand this, let's delve a little deeper into the history of royal burials in ancient Egypt. Since the unification of Egypt by Pharaoh Menes, Egyptian pharaohs followed the tradition of building two tombs for themselves, one in the north and one in the south. One was located in Abydos, while the other was built in Saqqara or near modern-day Giza. There are many such examples among the pharaohs, starting with the very first rulers. Even Pharaoh Djoser of the 3rd dynasty followed this tradition, having two tombs in the north and the other in the south. Pharaoh Sneferu of the 4th dynasty, the predecessor of Pharaoh Khufu and possibly Pharaoh Khafre, also built two tombs for himself. However, both were located in Djoser, the Red Pyramid, and the Bent Pyramid. Thus, it appears that Pharaoh Sneferu preserved the tradition of having two tombs. However, both were located in the north of Egypt, rather than one in the north and the other in the south. Pharaoh Sneferu of the 4th dynasty, the predecessor of Pharaoh Khufu and possibly Pharaoh Khafre, also built two tombs for himself. However, both were located in Djoser. Thus, it appears that Pharaoh Sneferu preserved the tradition of having two tombs. However, both were located in the north of Egypt, rather than one in the north and the other in the south. There is one exception, Pharaoh Huni, predecessor of Pharaoh Sneferu, who built only one pyramid in Medum. However, this was likely due to the fact that Pharaoh Huni died prematurely, leaving the pyramid unfinished. It appears that his successor, Pharaoh Sneferu, took on the task of completing it. Thus, it turns out that Pharaoh Sneferu did not just build two pyramids, but rather three, or at least 2.5, which is unprecedented in ancient Egyptian history. Can we be certain that Pharaoh Khufu built only one pyramid, and that Pharaoh Khafre also built just one? Or is it possible that they constructed something else as well? Or is there something unclear, something that doesn't quite add up? How could this have happened? And why was this long-standing tradition broken? Now, let's move on to the 4th set of questions that arise in connection with Pharaohs Khufu and Khafre. Let's take a closer look at the names of these pharaohs. Let us begin by considering the name of Pharaoh Khufu. As is well known, the full name of an Egyptian pharaoh consisted of 5 titles, a tradition that emerged during the 4th dynasty, after the reign of Pharaoh Khufu. During his time, the grammatical rules for writing royal names had not yet been standardized, so Khufu's name was recorded in an archaic and variable manner, with many different ways of writing it. Pharaoh Khufu's 4 royal names: Horus name, Medjidu, heir of Horus in Assyric; Nedi name, linked to 2 goddesses; Golden Horus name, eternal golden falcon; Nesu Biti, Khufu, under protection, in a cartouche. Pharaoh Khafre, likely Khufu's successor, introduced a significant change in his Nesu Biti name by including the symbol of the sun god Ra. This marks the rise of the solar cult during the 4th dynasty, indicating a religious shift that began under Khufu. Pharaoh Khafre, Khafre's successor, continued this tradition. His Nesu Biti name also begins with the Ra symbol, meaning the radiance of Ra, or he shines like the sun. There are many interpretations of this, but it is quite difficult to definitively determine the meaning of Pharaoh Khafre's name. Each researcher adheres to their own theory. It is also worth considering the phonetic aspect of Pharaoh Khafre's name. If we read the symbols of Pharaoh Khafre's name as phonetic signs, we get the following set of sounds: K-Fe-Re. We do not know the exact vocalization of the vowels in his name. Ancient Greek authors rendered his name as Khephren, as well as Sufis II. And here, a certain suspicion arises because the ancient Greek authors provide us with a clue that we will now examine in more detail. Now I'm going to propose a very cautious hypothesis, which I believe has the right to exist. Take a look at the picture. Let's compare the personal names of Pharaoh Khufu and Pharaoh Khafre. The symbols and the cartouches of these pharaohs look completely different. In Pharaoh Khufu's cartouche, we essentially see a phonetic rendering of his name. In Pharaoh Khafre's cartouche, the recording is more symbolic than phonetic. The hieroglyphs used to write Pharaoh Khafre's name are rich in meaning, with their phonetic value being secondary. But if we look solely at the phonetics, we may find that it is quite possible we are dealing with the same name recorded in different ways. This is entirely acceptable, because during the Old Kingdom, the grammar of the ancient Egyptian language had not yet been fully standardized. So, what do we see? If we read only the consonants, we come up with exactly the same name, Khuf. You might object that in Pharaoh Khufu's name, we do see signs that represent vowel sounds. Yes, I agree. But it is equally true that we do not know how those vowels were pronounced. Moreover, there are many cartouches of Pharaoh Khufu in which the last sign of his name is simply missing. For example, in modern English, we read the word Khufu using the U sound. However, if we write the name as Khuf, we could legitimately read it as Khaf. In other words, the U sound may shift to an A. It is also worth noting, a form of Pharaoh Khufu's name, in which the symbol of the god Khnum appears at the beginning of the word. In other words, his full name was Khnum Khufu. Then, for some reason, the pharaoh stopped using the symbol and the corresponding word of the god Khnum in his name, leaving simply Khufu. What could this be connected with? Perhaps it is related to the religious revolution I mentioned earlier, rise of the solar cult of the god Ra above all the other gods of ancient Egypt. And it was precisely Pharaoh Khufu who carried out this religious revolution. Now, here's the most interesting part. Could Pharaoh Khufu himself have changed his name in connection with the new religious practice? Of course he could. Such cases are well known throughout Egyptian history. Pharaohs changed their names in response to shifts in the religious paradigm. The most striking example is the New Kingdom Pharaoh Akhenaten, who, at the beginning of his reign, bore the name Amenemhet IV. So, what do we have here? Let's take another look at the picture. Apparently, Pharaoh Khufu might have performed the following manipulation with his name. First, he removed the symbol of the god Khnum from his name, and then, sometime later, he added the symbol of the god Ra in place of the Num symbol. Khnum Khufu becomes Khufu, then Khufu, Ra Khufu. In our time, it is customary to place the sound Ra at the end of the pharaoh's name, even though in the written form the symbol for Ra appears at the beginning of the word. Let's see what we get. Khnum Khuf, transformed to Khuf, and later it was transformed to Khuf Ra. Considering this, it is entirely possible to suggest that Pharaohs Khufu and Khafre are, in fact, the same person at different stages of his reign. Don't forget to put your likes under this video. Keep going. To support my bold hypothesis, I will present a few more arguments. First, let's discuss the statues of Pharaohs Khufu and Khafre. In fact, there is more than one statue attributed to Pharaoh Khufu, but these are rarely mentioned because there is number 0% certainty they represent Pharaoh Cheops. Look at this magnificent granite bust. Many scholars agree that it is a bust of Pharaoh Khufu. We see a handsome young man, and we also notice a striking resemblance to Pharaoh Khafre. So, could it really be the same person? This would explain why we have found many statues of Pharaoh Khafre and none of Pharaoh Cheops. As I mentioned earlier, these are simply statues depicting the same individual under different names. This is entirely logical. Second, let's return to the ancient Egyptian tradition of constructing two tombs for kings, as I discussed earlier. If we assume that Pharaohs Khufu and Khafre are the same person under different names, then it follows that both of the large pyramids on the Giza Plateau were built by a single pharaoh who bore two names, Khufu and Khafre. This is logical. All preceding pharaohs of ancient Egypt had two tombs. So why shouldn't Pharaoh Khufu Khafre have two tombs as well? Within this hypothesis, we also find an answer to the question of whom the Great Sphinx of Giza represents. It turns out that the Great Sphinx of Giza depicts Pharaoh Khufu Khafre. Let's take a closer look at the Giza Plateau. Perhaps we can find something else that supports the hypothesis that Pharaohs Khufu and Khafre are the same historical figure. At first glance, the Giza Plateau shows that all the structures, including pyramids, mastabas, and temples, are not arranged randomly, but are laid out according to a clear plan. The Pyramid of Khafre occupies a central position, even though it is somewhat smaller than the Pyramid of Cheops. The Pyramid of Khafre features a well-developed supporting infrastructure, a massive mortuary temple, a processional road that descends from the Giza Plateau and leads to its valley temple. The valley temple itself is a large structure built from huge blocks. Adjacent to the valley temple stands the Great Sphinx, which is also enormous. Together, these architectural elements create what is probably the most recognizable and most photographed panoramic view, which you all know. Mastery, careful planning, and professionalism are evident in every detail of the Pyramid of Khafre complex. But where is the corresponding cult temple infrastructure for the Pyramid of Khufu? Good question. Such infrastructure simply does not exist for Khufu's pyramid. Yes, it must be mentioned that there is a basalt floor in the mortuary temple of the Pyramid of Khufu and remnants of a processional road leading from the Giza Plateau to the valley. But the scale of this infrastructure is much smaller than that of the Pyramid of Khafre. The facts described here speak to the central role of the Pyramid of Khafre in the architectural ensemble of the Giza Plateau. This may hint that all of this was built by one pharaoh rather than two. Now, let's take a look at what surrounds the pyramids on the Giza Plateau. As we can see, there is a large number of mastabas on the Giza Plateau tombs of officials and lower-ranking members of the pharaoh's entourage. The only question is, which pharaoh? Let's try to figure it out. As shown in the image, practically all the mastabas are situated around Khufu's pyramid. These are large mastabas, built according to an overall master plan. There are several types and sizes of mastabas: large, medium, and small. We see straight streets and blocks of mastabas arranged to the west and east of Khufu's pyramid, with a few mastabas also located on its southern side. Now, let's examine who is buried in these mastabas. For example, here you can see the mastaba of Vizier Hemiunu, a close relative of Pharaoh Khufu, who is traditionally believed to have overseen the construction of Khufu's pyramid. There are also tombs of other notable figures from Khufu's era, as well as those of his relatives. This forms a vast necropolis, and in fact, it is from the inscriptions on these mastabas that we know the history of the Giza Plateau. On the other hand, we do not observe any mastabas near Khafre's pyramid. Yes, there are a few shaft-type tombs and mastabas to the east of Khafre's pyramid, but their distribution is entirely haphazard, lacking any unified plan. Their scale is much smaller than that of the necropolis around Khufu's pyramid, and their quality is undoubtedly inferior. Looking at this picture raises a question. Where are all the close associates, relatives of Pharaoh Khafre, and the overseers of Khafre's pyramid's construction buried? And the answer is simple: there are no such burials. There are no tombs for relatives or high officials, and the few close associates that did exist have their tombs in the necropolis near Khufu's pyramid. Looking at the Giza Plateau, one can boldly conclude that the two large pyramids and the adjacent necropolis were built by a single pharaoh, not two. It all makes perfect sense. Here lie the two tombs of the pharaoh, as dictated by ancient tradition, along with the tombs of all his close associates, relatives, and prominent figures. This is exactly what we see. And the name of this pharaoh is Khufu. At the beginning of his regnant, he is the same person as Khafre at the end of his reign. It seems perfectly logical, doesn't it? There's one more point worth noting, which I only briefly touched on in my discussion because it isn't entirely clear. Here's the thing. If you add up the reigns of the three pharaohs Khufu, Djoser, and Khafre, get 3 generations, roughly 100 years. However, the available evidence does not indicate that the Giza Pyramid complex was built over 100 years. The prevailing view is that the Great Pyramids were built in about 50 years, that is, half the time it would have taken if they were constructed by 2 different pharaohs. If the construction had spanned 100 years, there would obviously be many more tombs for the pharaoh's associates. But such tombs do not exist. Instead, we find only the tombs of individuals, mostly associates of Pharaoh Khufu. This is yet another argument in favor of my hypothesis. I also deliberately did not include Pharaoh Menkaura's pyramid in my discussion. I refrained from discussing this pyramid because I am preparing a separate story about Pharaoh Menkaura and his pyramid. We know much more about Pharaoh Menkaura than about Pharaoh Khufu Khafre. So, see you soon. Thank you for watching my video.